And he said, I learned to put my people first. That's exactly how he said it. He said, because I didn't for a while. And I realized I had a whole yard full of equipment and nobody to operate it. Right? He had gone through a big crunch. And the flip side of that is sometimes, and again, I have to pull my judgment back, because sometimes people, they're doing things that are not as human-centric as you and I would support. And they're saying, hey, we're doing fine. Look at our financials. And they may be, I don't know. But there's another indicator we can look at to see if they're diluting themselves. So that's the churn rate. Show me your churn rate. And if they can't hang on to people, and if they take the time to look at how much that's costing them, because that can be a hidden cost, can't it? Eventually you see it in the bottom line, but for a long time that can be tucked away in cost of training and retraining and so on. It's funny because he keeps bringing up simple. I'd say the simple is the most powerful thing. And but not easy. I mean, simple, not easy.
Yeah.
Getting a black belt simple. Practice. You practice enough, you'll get there. Is it easy? It's long, it's arduous, it's painful, it's self-deprecating, and all these. Am I drawing a good picture of it? Positive experience, but that's what it is. And the same thing, leadership is simple. Take care of your people. Share. Is it easy? No.
Hello and welcome back to Leading with Integrity. And today we're going to be hearing a remarkable story of recovery, of change, and how my guest today, Jim Bouchard, went from musician and drug addict to the leadership activist that he is today. It's a remarkable story that leads us into all kinds of leadership lessons that he's learned along the way, why he does what he does today, and what business owners, leaders, managers the world over can learn from that experience too. So I won't be beating around the bush with the intro today. We're going to jump straight into this conversation because honestly, I can't wait to get into it. Jim is such a great conversationalist, and he is so generous with his stories, with his time, with his insights that I literally can't wait to get into this episode. So I hope you'll enjoy it too.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Jim, welcome to Leading with Integrity. I've been looking forward to this conversation since our last unrecorded one. Welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
We should have recorded that last one. That was a nice talk.
It's always the way, isn't it?
Right? There you go. Well, here we are.
Yeah, we're not making that mistake this time. Definitely, it is right. Recording. It tells me it is. So I mean, let's jump in at the deep end. Really, over to you to tell the listeners a bit about yourself, your background, your career so far, and it's been an interesting one, I know. So I'm looking forward to that as well. And then what you do today and why, really.
Yeah, I've had a few adventures. Kind of start where we are now. I'm a leadership activist. So I do a lot of speaking and writing along those lines. I've been blessed to be able to share these ideas, all over the world. It kind of started with, and I don't remember if I told you the story when we first met, but years ago, I ran martial arts centers. One of my books, The Sensei Leader, people often ask me, are you a real sensei, or is that just a cool title? I said, no, that's how I spent about 30 years of my life. Dressed up in pajamas and chasing kids around. Yeah. So, that doesn't sound good when you say it that way, right? But, I was asked to go to a local elementary school to talk about respect and responsibility, because the kids in my program were very respectful, outside, which was good. And they were having issues at that particular school. So they thought maybe I could help. And, so I went and I prepared this question, and I still ask it today, whether I'm talking to kids or C-suite executives. I ask for a definition of the word respect. It's a word we use a lot, but it's not a word we think about very deeply very often. So anyway, this little guy stood up, and I always get emotional telling his story, but they prepped the sensei was there, so he knew what he was doing. He made our symbol, and he bowed to me, and he said, "Sensei," he said, "respect means taking care of one another." And I don't know if you've ever heard a better definition but I certainly hadn't heard one like that. And it threw me. I felt like I got punched in the gut. I physically sat down. There was a chair. I sat down for a minute. And you've done some speaking, so it was probably 5 seconds or so. It felt like 5 minutes. And he threw me. And so all I could think of to do was I stood up and I bowed to him and I said, "Kid, I think you got it." And I didn't know it at the time, but that moment was going to change the trajectory of my life. And hey, if you're out there listening, get in touch with me, because I've been hunting you down, trying to thank you for years. One of my fantasies, I hope that sometime I'm presenting and he stands up and says, "Hey, I was that kid." That would be kind of cool. So anyway, how did I get to that particular moment? I started the whole adventure really in an episode of drug addiction. So in my early 20s, I was in the music business. I was a full-time musician, and that's not why I got involved in drugs, but it provided easy access to that escape, and lost about 3 years of my life to a pretty bad drug episode. And in that time, dropped out of college a couple of times. So along the way, somehow I found an appreciation for where I was, and started to say, look, I've got to change things and get going. That's what led to martial arts, because that became part of my recovery process. And then that evolved quite accidentally into leadership. Now, I used to think that drug addict and dropout was a pretty poor resume for someone dealing with leadership, but came to realize it was pretty useful. I mean, as leaders, aren't we in the transformation business? And that's what I had to do to escape that life. I had to transform myself from the catchphrase we use is from a loser to a leader, right? From a drug addict to a black belt leader to sensei, and so on. I think leaders need to embrace that process of transformation. You're transforming yourself, you're transforming your organization, you're transforming the people around you. And if you're not changing, if you're not growing and transforming, then you're not going anywhere. You're going backwards. That's just the way the world is today. Well, not just today. I think Pliny the Elder, many years ago, said the only constant in life is change, right? So, that's to embrace it. And so one of the best philosophies one of the best gifts I ever got from my life as a martial artist was this little philosophy, is that perfection is not a destination. It's a never-ending process. And if we embrace that as leaders, well, we're taking some pretty good first steps, I think. So that's the short version of how we ended up here today. And we threw out some of the twists and turns.
Trying to figure out where to start with that. So
the show's not long enough for all the twists and turns.
No. Well, we'll do our best, won't we? But so, I mean, let's start with first thing. I think actually there's a lot of credibility in that story for leadership, because it's, as you say, it's the process of transformation, but it's also like the self-awareness, the self-improvement, the lifelong learner thing, which I love that whole concept as well. I think, I've said before, as a leader in any situation, like the day that you draw that line in the sand and say, right, I've learned everything I need to know about leadership. That's it. I'm done. You're effectively saying I'm now a perfect leader. I don't need to improve anymore.
I've met a couple of them.
Yeah, I think we all have.
They're very good about telling us that they're perfect.
Yeah. And what I always say, and the listeners will have heard me say this before, I'm sure, is the second you draw that line and you make that statement, whether it's verbalized or not, you've stopped being a leader, because you're no longer doing that key part, I think, of leadership, which is the constant self-improvement and the honing that skill and practicing and improving.
The best are never satisfied. The best leaders that I'm blessed to meet, some tremendous leaders and work with tremendous leaders, that they're the ones who are never satisfied. They're the ones who are always looking in the mirror. And it's interesting because I think it was Gallup that did this, probably Gallup. It was either Gallup or Harvard Business that I ran into this, but I think it was Gallup. They did this study that showed that, they asked leaders to self-evaluate their quality, right, as a leader. And they found that when they cross-indexed that with actual performance and other people's perceptions, they found that the leaders who were most self-critical, who were most uncertain about their own performance, they were the ones who were the top performers. The ones who were certain they were doing a great job and they were certain that other people appreciated their leadership, they were the ones who were the least effective. So, that's a correlation that we've understood in the martial arts for, forever. And, most of what I share really came from my experience learning how to be a leader. Sensei by default is a leader, right? And we can talk about why that definition is so important. But, that's it. One of those, in fact, if people go on my website, somewhere there's a picture of my actual black belt. And part of the reason I share my story about being a drug abuser is that when I earned that black belt was the best day of my life. It was the first time I'd really achieved anything meaningful, and certainly the first time I'd been recognized for achieving anything meaningful. Well, at the test, they give you kind of a cheap one. So when I got home, my master had a gift for me. It was a heavyweight black belt, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Rich, dark black. Oh, it's just perfect. But he said, if you continue your life in the arts, this thing's going to change over time. You're going to get dragged across it, Florida. You're going to tie it and untie it thousands of times. You're going to sweat it, bleed it, cry in it. And certainly all that stuff happened. But what happens is it grays. That happens to the best of us. It fades and grays. But more important, the black covering frays off. It wears off. Now, on purpose, underneath, there's a white belt. And what does that remind us of, right? That's the beginning. So in martial arts, we call this philosophy beginner's mind. So when you see somebody wearing that frayed belt and you see the white belt underneath it, that's to remind us of beginner's mind, to approach each day with a sense of wonder and curiosity and a desire to improve further, right? So we kind of incorporated that philosophy into our black belt ceremony. We were very proud of a couple of things that we did there. One was once the belts were all tied on, which was always a beautiful thing, right? Everybody's tying on their new belts, and it's, all right, now raise your hands up high, reach behind your back, pat yourself on the back. That's it. Let's get back to work, right? And to reinforce that, we had some really ancient symbolism. We would always have a bowl of rice and a vessel of water in front of us. And the old philosophy was, and this is a couple of thousand years old, before I was enlightened, I carried my water and gathered my rice. Now that I'm enlightened, I carry my water and gather my rice. So it's a beautiful moment when you have those moments of success and recognition, right? But then it's very important to say, good, pat yourself on the back. Now let's get back to work. And again, the best leaders are people that really embrace that mindset or embody that mindset.
Yeah. And I love that metaphor with the belt as well, the way you almost like you're resetting.
Right. Yeah.
That's amazing.
But that doesn't apply. My Taekwondo friends, their masters make them buy new belts all the time. So they don't get that nice symbolism.
That's interesting. Yeah. So what sort of martial arts were you doing then?
The through line actually was Kempo, but I had a lot of interesting side trips and was blessed with many incredible teachers. We might end up talking about Dr. Yang Zhuang-Ming at one point, who was one of the greatest influences on not just my martial arts, but my life and my philosophy as a leader too. And he's quite known for a number of different things, but he was one of the leading experts in Tai Chi in the world too. And that's how I got involved with him. So yeah, brilliant person. If you're listening, Dr. Yang, I appreciate every moment I spent with you. Yeah.
Another phrase you use that I'd love to pick up on and hear a little bit more about, leadership activist. Now that's an unusual pair of words together, I think. We don't hear those in that order very often. So yeah, what does that mean to you, and how does that I guess present itself in what you do? First of all,
it wasn't AI generated. I'll say that.
No, it's too clever for that, clearly. Like
I don't know about clever, but it comes out of an exercise that I ask leaders to do every year. And most years, I don't think I've skipped too many. I try to do the same. Take a day of reflection, right? And ask a couple of very broad questions. Who am I? What do I do? And the reason we keep those questions broad, I found that, and I think we're all guilty of it, especially those of us who do workshops and whatnot, right? That sometimes we've got to be careful. We'll craft questions, whether it's consciously or not, to try to elicit a certain response, right? Or steer people in a certain direction. And there's nothing wrong with that, when it's purposeful on an exercise. But if we really want to get as much information as we can, we have to pull back from that. We have to kind of remove our prejudices from the question. So those two questions, while they might sound pretty rudimentary, they can lead to some pretty incredible insights. Who am I? What do I do? And of course, in a workshop, if people take the easy way out, well, I'm the CEO of a company. No. We're going to dig deeper than that. There's some tears in the room. So, one couple of years ago, when I was asking that question, broadly, for years, I've come back with the response of teacher for both. So speaking and writing and doing all those things is another way to teach and share information, right?
Mm-hmm.
But somewhere along the line, it was, I kind of felt that I was becoming sort of an evangelist for this human-centric leadership idea. And so the term activist kind of came out of, it wasn't, not to diminish teaching. I think teaching is one of the most important vocations anyone can embrace. But I think, did have a little clever appeal, maybe, but people kind of look at it a little differently. What does that mean? Well, it means that I'm really trying to get out there and shake the bushes a little bit and get people to pay attention to this idea, right? That putting people first, that the best leaders are the people who care.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I mean, you're on the right podcast with that view, definitely.
Right? I got that impression the first time believe me, I'm picky about what podcasts I go on.
Yeah. So interesting. So there's another, I guess, a philosophical debate, isn't there, around it? I mean, it's more than just leadership, isn't it? It's like our identities and how that gets mixed up with work. And so that question you ask, and then the answer of, well, I'm the CEO, like immediately in my mind, I was thinking, no, that's what you do. That's not who you are. And I think there's a cultural thing, isn't there, particularly in the Western world, and with, let's not go down the bashing capitalism route, because we'll be here another 3 hours if we do that. But I think, I mean, certainly in small businesses, in startups, in anything that's seen as like entrepreneurial, there's this whole sort of subculture around that where what you do, what your business does, becomes your identity. And I mean, what are your experiences and thoughts on that as well? I'd love to hear your perspective.
Well, first of all, if we get behind that a little bit, there's a lot of confusion. All these philosophical debates have to start with some sort of clarity of the words we're using, right? We have to define our terms, get our semantics clear. I believe strongly there's a lot of confusion between the words manager and leader, right? Mm-hmm. Management and leadership. Admiral Grace Hopper said it so well quite a few years ago. She said, management is about things, leadership is about people. I don't know that anybody's ever said it better than that. Now, both are important, right? You've got to take care of business too. But think about what your business is. Your business is the people, right? If you're not taking care of your people, you're not taking care of your business. And if you're not taking care of your people, they won't take care of your business, right? That's proven over and over and over again. As of this year, we've reached the highest levels of disengagement in the workplace. Quiet quitting, what do they call it now? Revenge quitting. People that are sitting there purposely not doing anything, right? Because they're dissatisfied, and usually with their leadership, with the leadership direction, the way that they're being led or not. So that's really important. Now, at the same time, if we look at it that way, leadership has nothing to do with rank or title or position. You are a leader, whether you want to be or not, whether you think you are or not, because fundamentally, and this exercise started with asking, I was working with some of my instructors in our instructors college and said, what does a sensei really do? And I'm shortening about 3 years of thought in this process, but came down to the 3 words that we emphasize on our website: inspire, empower, guide. And that became the title of the latest book that I wrote, Inspire, Empower, Guide. Essential disciplines for today's leader. And the reason they're so essential, because fundamentally, when you pare everything down that a true leader does, it fits into one of those 3 buckets. Now, inspire, I mean touching people's hearts, not just their heads, right? Empower, make sure they have what they need to succeed. And in workshop, that can extend over a day or 2, right? And guide, be willing to share your wisdom, your experience, your knowledge face to face. And in a technical term, in business, we would call it mentoring, right? How to mentor and how to receive mentorship properly. So those are the 3 big things. If you take care of that, you're gonna do okay. You don't have to be Martin Luther King or Winston Churchill and have a bombastic speech. It's what you do every day. It's the example you provide for people. It touches their hearts. These things. And so, having said that, when we boil it down to those 3 things, what does a leader really do? When I'm pressed about, to summarize all this, I said, well, leadership is sharing, and a leader shares. And ultimately, we're sharing those things. So the rest of the conversation, which can be very long, like you say, you get the idea. I'm not lollipops and rainbows here, right? we roll up our sleeves and really get to it, because it's nice to talk philosophy. I'm glad to do that, especially over a nice bottle of wine, but we have to put it to work. We have to make it work. And so we have to sit down and say, how do we create action steps? How do we implement these things? How do we put them to work? Now, I said everyone's a leader, right? Because you do that. I don't care if you're on the front line. Some of your greatest leaders are on the front lines. They don't want a position of authority. They don't want to become managers, but they inspire people around them, usually by their example. They empower people because they help provide some of what those people need. Sometimes it can be as fundamental as encouragement. Other times it might be training them and whatnot, right? And then guiding them to be there, be one-on-one, because most mentoring in any organization happens informally. It's peer mentoring, right? Which is good. It's powerful. We still need to make sure there's a formal process too that doesn't get left to chance. But having said that, we also have to appreciate and also support the idea that most mentoring is organic and it's peer-to-peer.
Yeah. I mean, I so agree with you about, well, everything you said there, really. But
well, we're not going to fight yet. We got to find a place to.
Well, let's give it a while. Yeah. So I think philosophy is, more generally, and theory, I guess, as well. I kind of see it very similar to having that sort of the guiding principles, the values, the vision, whatever buzzword you prefer. But it's important to have those conversations, because it becomes that guiding principle. When you get into a tough decision that you've got to make, that's what you fall back on. It's right, well, this is my philosophy, or these are my values. Therefore, that means in this situation, based on that, this is the best decision I can make. That or at least the one I can live with.
Well, you finally said something we can argue about. This will be fun. Where I'm going to debate you a little bit is on the words to fall back on. So, and I hear that a lot. That's the way most people would term that. I'd say no. That's where we have to build from. These things are so fundamental. They're so essential that if you're not taking care, and thank goodness now the researchers and the literature are coming around to it. Now, sometimes I'll take my copy of Harvard Business Review and I literally throw it across the room, because I'll say, you guys just spent $500,000 doing this study, and Lao Tzu said the same thing 2,000 years ago. And so there it is. And in fact, one of the recent issues of HBR, and I still have to put this out, I have an article that I'm working on called Why I'm Not Suing HBR for Plagiarism. All right. And part of the reason I'm not is because what they said is a universal truth. I mean, I didn't make it up. I recognize it. I hesitate to say discovered it, although we can all discover things again, right? Again, a big study that they did and came down to these three things, which I wrote in the Sensei Leader, to pat myself on the back, quite a few years ago. People perform at their best when and only when they know their leaders care, when their work has meaning, and when they have the chance to learn, grow, and develop. Okay. Now, again, I learned that in the dojo. How do we help people get to black belt? Hopefully beyond that, we had to embrace those things. Okay. Had to show them we cared about them. Had to make sure that they found meaning in that trip, because it can be a long, painful trip. Right. And we had to provide the environment where they felt that they were making progress, where they were learning, where they were growing, they were becoming who they want to become. So I'm glad that these researchers are recognizing that, and more, recognizing the importance of it, the essential nature of it. Now, we can't leave it there. That's the thing. When you talked about, philosophy, and believe me, I love to talk philosophy. Philosophy is essential as well. But now let's take that and let's break it down to process. Let's make sure that we create the exercises, we create the environment where people can express. And you notice I keep using this word discipline. Inspire, empower, guide. Those are disciplines, not little things to check off, action steps, to-do lists. I hate to-do lists. Too easy to put stuff on there. No, I mean, embed these things in your practice, in your daily life, in your weekly life, in your annual, meetings on. These are things that need to be embedded in your culture and in your practice. Yeah. And that's the work that we do in workshops. I mean, because it's easy to talk about this stuff. But to sit down and say, all right, now how are you're going to come out of here after 2, 3, 4 days, how are you actually going to make this happen? And how are you going to keep it happening when you start getting bored with it? Because there's one of the conundrums, right? The best The highest levels of skill require focus, discipline, and simple practice. You've got to take care of the fundamentals. And the problem is, let's equate it very simple terms. I remember one time, I had a guest master coming in, one of the masters that I had studied with, and he was renowned for his kicking ability. So he got there, and one of my students asked him, he said, "Master, how do you become really good at kicking like you?" He said, he looks like this, kick.
Yeah.
And he was right.
Perfect, right? Yeah.
But kick thousands and thousands of times, right? And then, as you touched on earlier, be able, that sense of, I believe leaders need today to be effective. They need to lead with courage, with compassion, and with wisdom. They need to have highly developed interpersonal skills, and they need to have highly developed sense of self-awareness. Okay. And I mean genuine self-awareness, painful self-awareness. Do the simple things over and over again, and constantly look in the mirror, question yourself. Am I doing the best I can? What can I do to improve? And again, preaching to the choir, I know with you, but the best leaders, that's what they do. When we model them, that's what they do.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot interesting in there. I guess and fall back on was a poor choice of words on my part, but I think.
No, that's okay. It was good inspiration for.
No, and it's a good conversation. I think what I was trying to get at really was largely, as you've just said. Actually, it's I love the theory of it. I love the philosophy of it. I could talk about that endlessly, and I do. But also, I see huge value in the actual practical applications of these things, because what's the point of all of that theory if it's never realized? It's, as interesting as it is, it's useless otherwise.
Yeah, but that's where it starts, right? And if we don't,
Absolutely.
That's the thing too. I think sometimes people think, sit around talking about the philosophy, it's a waste of time. No, it's not. That's where these ideas come from, right?
It's only a waste of time if you don't implement it.
Exactly.
And but a lot of people don't. I guess that's where I was coming from. And so,
it's hard.
Back on wrong choice of words, but it's joining those two things together, isn't it? And that's where I think the real gains, the real impact are.
But you're absolutely right. It's hard to put these things to work. And, when this is something that comes up in workshops all the time. Because this stuff, sometimes can you imagine me being blunt?
Surely not. No.
Well, sometimes I'll just look, everything we're talking about is dumb. It's stupid. It's simple. We know this stuff, right? How do we get it to work? And why don't we sometimes? And, I'm condensing years of workshops, but the two that come back the most, the resistance to these things, at what? Time. And we have other priorities, there are other urgencies. I get it. I get it. I understand that. I've been there myself. But that's where discipline comes in again. We have to consciously pull back from the edge of that cliff, because there it is. If we're so wrapped up in the technical ends of things, if we're so wrapped up in the accounting, the meetings, the whatever the case may be on a technical management level, and we forget about people, then what happens? Ultimately, they leave. And again, don't believe me. Read the current editions. You should get commission from Harvard Business Review, right?
Yeah.
But that's a good source. The Wharton publications, the Gallup publications, these are all good sources. And they're all saying the same thing. But what they're saying reinforces what we all know. If you put people first, you're going to be in a lot better position. Particularly today, there's too many choices. People are so mobile. It's not just leaving a company to another company. People are leaving and going across the world, right, to find satisfaction in their jobs. So.
Yeah, and it's a hell of a lot easier to move industries as well than it used to be.
Or you can work across the globe from your desk here, right?
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to relocate anymore, do you? Well, potentially. It's not a given, is it? Not yet.
I think that's too bad too, though, because if I want to work in Africa, part of it is I want to explore Africa, right?
Yeah, but equally, there's
not everybody
stopping
thinks
you either. So it goes both ways, doesn't it? So you could keep your current job and go and do it from Africa and explore if you wanted to, right? Well, internet allowing, but
there you go.
Although, parts of Africa have better internet than, places in
right.
the West.
There is that, right? Yeah.
Certainly parts of this country, definitely Australia, probably parts of the US as well, to be fair.
I live in the woods of Maine, so it can be challenging up here too.
There you go. So yeah, it's a brave new world, isn't it?
It sure is.
And I think it's really exciting. And we're going off on a tangent now, aren't we? But
No, that's okay. Yeah.
It's one of those things where you see so many leaders and managers who are almost like afraid of this change. And I think it's more than just that natural fear of change that everyone has for any, new and different thing, isn't it? But I don't know, maybe it's the COVID of it all. Maybe that was slightly traumatic to managers. I don't know. But to me, if people are more productive and happier, why not? What's there to be afraid of in that? I don't get it so much.
Yeah, I think it's still going to take us a while to reconcile the two, because, yeah, it's nice that we have these connections. In fact, what are the chances that you and I would have met face to face, right? We might have, but certainly this way, this facilitated it, and we're able to connect. And on the other hand, this is one of the great lessons I took out of COVID, because when COVID hit, we were facing our busiest schedule ever. And in 4 weeks, we saw that evaporate, disappear, right? And then basically was on the bench for a couple of years. Now, I did some virtual. I don't particularly like it. I do smaller groups virtual. I do some coaching virtual, work with especially after I've met face to face. But I'm a hugs and handshakes guy. There's no substitute for us being in the room together. And when I got back on the road, it was fascinating, because some of the conferences that I was a regular at, we'd get there and there were people that I had met, and everybody's just in tears and oh, it's so nice to be together again, right? We have that need. And there's things that happen. There's an amazing energy, because one of the things that we've seen from the explosion of remote work, initially, interestingly enough, there was a kind of an uptick in innovation and creativity. And I was cautious about that. I said, maybe because people are they have some time to root around in their heads a little bit right now, but I'm wondering if that's going to be sustainable. And it's proven out that it's not. Now the innovation creativity is dipping again, where remote work is the dominant form.
I wonder if that was less about remote work and more about the fact that entire industries had shut down and the workload was dropping. And so they had that more sort of spare headspace, if you like.
It could be, but I'm wondering too if it's just there's so much that happens communication-wise when we're in the same space, right? Nonverbal doesn't even do it credit, right? There's so much that happens between us when we're in the same room that have nothing to do with the words that we're saying. And I think that's it. For example, I don't want to offend any of my speaker friends, but Meeting Planners International did a survey some years ago and asked what people thought were the most effective sessions at any conference, right? Well, I'd like to think it's the Keep It Human session, but I don't have that much ego. I hope people take something good out of it. But it was happy hour. It was the social sessions. And it makes sense. Now, that doesn't devalue all the other sessions you go to. You get this information, but where do you really bring it together? Where do you really talk with people as human beings? Let your hair down. Well, you can let your hair down. I can't. But that's where it happens. That's where we interact with each other, heart to heart. And so I think there's a balance. On the other hand, we're starting to learn, I believe, how to communicate more effectively this way. But I do believe it has its limitations. So there's a place for both. I think I'm back to my martial arts world again, that yin and yang, right? Dynamic balance.
I was going to say, I think it's a question of balance, isn't it? Like so many things in leadership and beyond. Because I think, I agree. I think like in person definitely has value, but I do see it. And there's so many caveats to this, aren't there? Like it depends on the industry. It depends on the culture of the place where you're working. It depends on like the perspective of your leader or manager, the person you're working for. It depends on you as an individual as well.
It does. And I'm saying that coming from the perspective of, I always test as an introvert. Many speakers and entertainers do. Yeah. And I'm very comfortable being alone. I go out in the woods for a couple of weeks at a time, sometimes just by myself, and don't feel any real desire to see other.
No, I'm the same.
So, but then still, that again, that has to be balanced, right? We don't do well in isolation as human beings. So at some point I have to come back and deal with the rest of you creatures.
Yeah, I don't know. So I guess I'm one of those weird people who like, I can take it or leave it. Like I'm perfectly content by myself.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
necessarily feel lonely that much.
Right.
But also I do quite like being around people sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, and I mean, this is only a case study of one. But so like 5-10 years ago, I was always testing on like fairly high on the introvert scale. Now, last one I did, I was bang in the middle, like between both, like literally. So like
You're
I've swung
evolving. That's cool.
Right across. And the only thing really that's changed is I no longer work for someone else, and I no longer spend all day every day in a noisy office. And I think that context, it has such a big impact and we don't always realize it. And I think that's what I meant when I said, I think the in-person environment is a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, especially if you've got like really deep thought work required and you need concentration and you're sat in that bustling, noisy office, it's so difficult. Maybe it's just me, but
right?
I always struggled with that.
What you're saying is really important because you're also hitting on another failed experiment here, which was that whole idea of the open concept office, right? And I still see companies trying to embrace that. Now, having said that, I've learned I'm a judgmental person, and I've learned in this business, I've trained myself to pull that judgment back sometimes, right? Because if it works for you, hell, then that's the way to do it. Whether I think it's the optimal way or not has nothing to do with it, right? The important thing is we get to what's optimal for your environment, for your culture. But now let's talk about it in general. Most of the places that tried that open concept office, you know what they ended up doing? They spent all this money ripping out the cubicles, opening the space up. And then 3 or 4 years later, what did they do? They built little isolation booths, right?
Yeah.
So people can go and have that time. So again, it's important because you're right. The noise, the distractions can affect folks, right? Especially, and it's interesting because especially if we're introverted, because we're more bothered by that. You see, it's harder for us to tune that out. It's busy. It's just like, that's in our way, right? So we need to seek the quiet spaces. And now companies are starting to provide, like I said, I just went to one where it was kind of funny because it was all open concept and there was whole line against the wall. And those were they were like glorified phone booths, right? From the old days.
Yeah.
And I said, what's that? And they said, oh, that's where people go for quiet.
It's a funny one, isn't it? I mean, you describe it as a failed experiment. I'm trying to think of an office I've ever, not even just worked in, but ever been in that wasn't open plan concept.
See, that's how old I am. I'm older than dirt.
I can't think of any. But I mean, you're right. It is a failed experiment.
Yeah.
You know, there's studies and it's proven it doesn't work. There's a very small number of people who thrive in that environment. They're usually that sort of overbearing manager who needs to see everyone to trust everyone, right?
Well, and that's interesting too, because I know the first time we met, we were talking about Elon Musk a little bit, and one of the things I thought was fascinating about him was he realized that he needed more input from the front lines, right? That he wasn't understanding what was going on through the whole manufacturing process. So his response to it was, instead of his beautiful corner office they had built for him, he moved his desk right into the middle of the factory floor, right? Because that allowed him to kind of have a 360 view and to be able to communicate with people as they were, doing the roll up your sleeves work. So, again, but what's right and what's wrong, I don't know. The important thing is that leaders sit down and evaluate that and analyze it. Make sure they're listening to the people on the front lines. What are their needs? What helps them optimize their work? That's part of that empowerment phase, right? Do they need quiet space? Do they need more interaction? Do they need a combination of the two? And I know we're straying into a very technical area there, but see, that's where the intersection is between the philosophy and the technical, right?
Absolutely.
We can talk about empowerment all around. Now let's get specific. What do they need? And that can be highly technical. I mean, on the surface, the easiest, most tangible thing, I need certain equipment to do my job, right? I need a budget of a certain amount to get my job done. Those are simple, not always easy, but simple. what the rest of what we're talking about can get pretty complicated. How do we create that environment? How do we create that space? How do we support social interactions, or how do we mitigate social interactions that can be destructive, which is a huge challenge right now. That can be extremely complex, right? I have friends that work in human resource. I hate that term, but human resources and DEI and whatnot. These things can be extremely complex.
They certainly can. I mean, it's all complex, isn't it? If you make it so, or if you let it be, or if you think about it too long.
Think about who we're mashing together in these spaces, rather confined spaces. I mean, we have even small organizations now. It's very likely they have people from all over the world, different cultures, different religious backgrounds, different ethnic beliefs and values, all crammed into a small space. And, those are things we need to navigate. And for the first time this year, in fact, I believe it was Gallup that just reported this. For the first time, we have 4 generations working in the same space, right?
Yeah.
That's a pretty big challenge right there.
Yeah. So, I mean, the generational one is it's another one that I could talk about endlessly because it's really interesting. But I feel like maybe socially, maybe a lot of management consultant types, I think we put people in a generational box too easily. And I think it is one of those things that it is so easy to generalize and then just stop putting any further thought into it. I mean, like the classic one, and I'm not biased because I am an old millennial, but the classic one was that millennials are lazy, right? But most of the hardest working people I've ever known were millennials. So, and then likewise, like some of the most tech savvy, switched on people I've ever worked with were like that, the sort of the boomer generation, I guess they call it in the States, which is a bit pejorative now as well, of course. So apologies if that's triggering to anyone, and it's by putting it, I guess it's the same with any, you take any protected characteristic. If you put people in that box based on what they look like or where they're from or what their religion is, whatever it may be, you're completely missing the point, I think.
You're opening up a Pandora's box there, aren't you?
Absolutely.
It's because there's a lot of interesting trips we can take from there, and one that I'm thinking of, first of all, the generational cohorts we're talking about, boomer, millennial, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, all that stuff, those are defined primarily by academics, right? Mm-hmm. Because we need labels, and you start to say, okay, it is a little bit more than random. I've come to understand. They look at a basket of characteristics and they say, okay, the majority of people born between these particular periods seem to have most of these characteristics. But this is a reason I have a lot of problems with assessment tools, or at least how they're applied. An assessment should be the beginning of the conversation, not the end of it. And too often people will read an assessment, or they'll put somebody in that generational cohort, and that's it. There's the fixed picture. And that's not, first of all, the exceptions are oftentimes more important than the rule when it comes to that, right? Absolutely. No assessment is going to tell me what you feel, how you perform, who you really are. They're just going to tell me how you fit into the picture compared to other people. Yeah. And it's the same thing with these generational cohorts. In fact, I was doing a workshop a couple of years ago, and someone brought that up. She said she was a manager of mostly millennials, and she said, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to inspire these people, get them to do more than they show up. They do, I've got a good crew. They show up and they do what they're supposed to do. But how do you get them to do more? And I said, well, just so happens there was another young manager there. And I said, this young woman volunteered to represent the entire millennial generation. So after lunch, I'm the wrong guy to ask. I'm not a millennial. I'm older than dirt. But when we come back, we're going to ask her, how do we inspire that cohort? Well, we got back from lunch, and the first person stood up and asked her question. And the millennial person stood up, and you know what she said? She said, you know what? I'm having the same problem. I can't get the Gen X's to do.
Amazing. Yeah.
And I laughed. I said, I couldn't hope for a better setup. I said, see, and the next generational cohort's going to have the same issue. I said, the fact that there are generational divides, and the most tangible way we see that, not to stray too technical right now. We're not doing a workshop right now, right? But if we were in a workshop, I'd be saying, let's look at the language. The language provides the markers, right? What's the lingo? What are the words I don't understand? Then I know I've reached a cohort divide there. And then the opportunity that comes out of that challenge is now let's define those terms. Let's reach out to that, but let's try to understand. The one I won't tolerate is, and I'm going to say to particularly to the Gen Z and Gen Ys, you talk too damn fast. I always have to say, I can't process that fast,
and
please.
Music's too loud and all.
No, I don't mind that. I came from the rock and roll age. You can't have too loud music, but I often have to. But that's my obligation. If I'm not hearing it, it's on me to say, I'm sorry, it's my fault. I'm not processing fast enough. Can you please slow down for me? I appreciate it. Yeah.
It's an interesting one. I mean, maybe it's overly simplistic, but I always feel like the second you start thinking about people in terms of a group to which they belong that is not relevant to the job or the team,
it's dangerous, isn't it?
It's the top of a slippery slope, but also I think it leads you down the path of wrong thinking in terms of leadership. And I've always found, and again, oversimplifying it, but if you just view people as people and as individuals and just try to get to know and understand them on that basis and forget any preconceived notion of, what age they are, where they grew up, whatever it is, usually you can't go far wrong. As long as if your memory's not great, take notes, like you're not in front of them. That tends to send the wrong message, but note it down somewhere afterwards. Just remember things about them and relate to them on a personal level. And usually, as I say, you can't go far wrong from that because understanding them has to be the first step.
I want to support you entirely with that. And I'm not disparaging people who study these generalizations. They are useful, they inform us a little bit, but we cannot let the characteristics of the group define the individual because it just doesn't, right? It can help us from the 30,000 foot view, but we should never allow that to dictate our interaction with the individual. I support you 100%. The big objection I hear to that from leaders is usually, well, Jim, I have 10,000 people. I can't get to know everybody one-on-one. I said, maybe not. You know what? But you can get to know representatives. Now we're back to, reducing people to smaller groups, but you can go down and meet people on the front lines and get to know some of them. And I met a guy, this guy ran a big company in Kenya, and ironically had about 10,000 people, in his organization. And he's the closest I've ever seen to someone who actually gets to know everybody one-on-one. And here's why. This is going to sound left field for a second, but hear me out. I was just talking to somebody about parents that have to be away from their children for a long period of time, whether it's military deployment or it's friends of mine that are still in music, right? Things like that. I've seen people do that successfully and people who were miserable at it. The ones who did it successfully, here's why. They have to be away for a long time, but when they're home, completely focused on that environment, right? And those people. Well, that's how Darshan was. He was incredible. When he would go to the front lines and talk to people, he wasn't there to pump them up and rally them and give them his, inspirational. He was there to understand them and to get to know them. So I heard from other people, when he's with you, he's with you. And he really sincerely listens. Now, this might get some people angry, and I have mixed feelings about Donald Trump. I've studied him for a long time. But I've heard that from him too. There's that picture that I think a lot of us get of him being abrasive and over the top and whatnot. Maybe because I grew up in a similar area and knew other people like that, and grew up in construction too, so you knew other people like it. But I've heard also people report that when you're close to him, and he's there in the room with you, and maybe that's a gift that some politicians have, that they're able to make you feel that you're the only person in the room. That people have said that about Bill Clinton, I've heard. So there's all of that to consider. So the lesson from that, whether you love people or hate people, doesn't matter. I mean, the lesson from that is when we're present with an individual, let's be present with that individual, right? Let's fully engage. If you don't care, don't bother, because people will read through it eventually. And I think that's key. So I want to come back and just support exactly what you said. Now, the individual is part of a team and an organization. That's the pushback. Now, the other pushback is time. Well, okay, then fine. Like I said, take some time to get to know somebody all the time. We're back to a discipline again, right?
Yeah.
Once a month, I don't care. If it's once a year, I don't care. But set aside some time to go down there and spend time with a representative individual of, and Sam Walton did that. He did something very interesting. He was highly criticized for in academic leadership. And the company doesn't do it anymore. It stopped doing it when he was not involved as much. What it was he would take 2 weeks every year, his upper level management, all his managers, C-suite, people who were making high 6 and low, even 7-figure incomes, 2 weeks on the front lines, loading trucks, clerking, stocking shelves, whatever it might be. And they would rotate year to year to different positions. Wow. What an impression that made. How inspirational was that to, first of all, the people on the front lines? The evil mirror of that is, and I always ask people, do you like Undercover? Do you like Undercover Boss, that show?
We don't really get it here. I've seen a few episodes here and there and clicked on social media and stuff. Yeah, some of them are really good.
When I'm live, I slam my hand down on the desk hard. I hate that show. I hate that show. Now, obviously, that's just a joke to get people thinking, but
yeah,
part of the takeaway from that is how can they be so obtuse, right? How can these guys not know what's happening down on the front line?
I mean, the cynic in me says because it's all staged.
Right. Yeah. There is that. But I think, like I said, the lesson, the takeaway is, it's what, going back to again, reinforce what you said.
Yeah.
Understand people as individuals. That takes time. Great leadership, just like great teaching, great education. What's the downfall of education all over the world? Trying to make it efficient. Great teaching is not efficient. It's understanding that person's needs and responding in real time to that person's needs and pace. And leadership is exactly the same. I mean, a great part of leadership is teaching. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the counter arguments that you've talked us through there, I don't have a lot of patience for the time argument, because in my head, what else are you doing that's more important than that? That's your job.
I agree with you.
That's what you should spend your time doing.
I agree with you.
The massive organizations one, I kind of get that, and I like the idea of like the 2 weeks. It reminds me of a quote. It's probably from a war film, which is weird. I think it was like We Were Soldiers, that Mel Gibson one, where there's that moment where he's like, everyone's job is to know your job and the job of the guy above you and the job of the guy beneath you, because if one of them goes, you've got to fill the gaps. Obviously, there's an imperative in that situation, but it's a good lesson for leadership as well. Like, don't just think about your lane. You've got to be thinking about others as well.
No, exactly.
But it's also a great way of making yourself relatable to others in the organization, isn't it? If they see you taking the time and the care to fully understand what they do.
Right. And it doesn't mean, for instance, just because it's low-hanging fruit, let's take Elon Musk, for example. It doesn't mean because Elon Musk runs this gigantic, space technology company that he has to know how to machine the parts that go into building the rocket engine, But he's a good example. I bet you he probably knows something about it. Yeah. Probably can't do it, but he probably knows that, I always fall back on Bill Belichick, the coach of the New England Patriots for so many years through their whole dynasty. And, he wasn't a terribly good football player himself when in his day, but he continues. He's so curious. He takes the time to educate himself and understand the different moving parts, maybe not in minutia, right? Because that's difficult. But again, once in a while, take the time to learn and understand. And let's couch it another way. First of all, the people you're dealing with directly is usually a small group, right? Mm-hmm. No matter how big the organization is. I think scientifically, what are we wired to work in groups of between 50 and 150 people, arguably? But you'll notice big organizations divide that way, right? We divide into divisions, into platoons, into battalions and things like that. So organically, we kind of organize ourselves that way. No excuse not to get to know the people in that closest circle, right?
Absolutely.
And then that expands, because if you're curious and engaged with those people, that's the culture that's going to spread and grow. And like I said, once in a while, though, go down to those front lines, and it's going to be so educational. It's going to be so enlightening to you, because especially, let's not say because, especially if you don't know what's going on there, because there's the thing. And now we're back to leaders at all levels, right? The term, technically, we call it leading up. That person on the front line, accept that responsibility. When someone from management comes down and they don't know what's going on, well, then you step up and educate them and say, hey, look, this is what's going on here. This is what we need. You know who does that very well? We do a lot of work with people in the credit union space. We do a lot of work with credit union associations. And at their conferences, it's rare not to hear some session where they're talking about paying attention to what the tellers are saying on the front lines, because they're the face of the organization. Those are the people interacting with the members. They don't even call them customers, the members, right? And so that's a good lesson we can all take.
Yeah, no, I like that. I feel like industries where they're heavily regulated, that seems like it's often more of a priority than others. But that might be an assumption.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way. Now you see, I'm going to write that down. I have to think about that.
Yeah, there must be some research on that, because I feel that's just popped into my head out of nowhere. So it might be a gross assumption that's totally wrong.
The research. Oh man, I get nailed on that so much. People say, Jim, you're going to do a study? I see research. Oh my God, we're drowning in data. We're drowning in research. There's so much. You don't need
There's
another.
Bound to be some. Yeah.
You don't need somebody going out, another person going out to do the research.
Somewhere.
Right. But on the other hand, especially with leaders, it's become a joke almost every presentation. Just remember who these guys are studying. They're studying you, right? So when you're doing things that are effective, that could end up in a Gallup report, right? If you're messing up, that can end up in a Gallup report, but they're looking at you. You are the data. So once in a while, it's fine to have a coffee break meeting and just break down what's going right and what's going wrong. You don't have to wait for Gallup and HBR to report on what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, if you are waiting for that, it's probably too late by the time you get it.
I hope not. I hope it's never too late.
Yeah,
but it is. But it is hard to fix that when a culture, it's not working. It's hard to fix that. Yeah.
The pace of change we work with these days as well. I mean, it's you've almost got to be 2 steps ahead just to break even, haven't you?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the good thing is everything we're talking about is ancient. It's ancient and it's immutable. It's
yeah. So that first study you mentioned about the managers, their performance versus their perception of performance.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I mean, as you were explaining about that, I think I've seen that study or an article about it as well. But in my head, immediately, it's Dunning-Kruger, isn't it? That's decades old.
Yeah.
And why is this new? Like, why is anyone surprised at that result? Like, of course.
and again, it's much older. I lean on a lot of the ancient Asian philosophy because of how I was trained, and heavily on Lao Tzu, because one of the great things that Lao Tzu said, and he said many, if he's even a real person, we think he might be a compilation, but it doesn't matter. The wisdom's there. What he said was, a leader is best when the people barely know he exists. When their work is done, they'll say, we did it ourselves. You see? So, that goes back and speaks to the heart of everything we're talking about. And this idea of the vulnerable leader, first of all, again, there was another study that validated this a couple of years ago, where one of the most important qualities of effective leadership is vulnerability. That will build trust and respect better than almost anything else. And I'll say this, I couch it this way. I've met more great orange belts than I have great black belts. And it's the same thing in leadership, right? When that person knows just enough to feel some sense of confidence and is bragging about their abilities and their skills, then you got to question, how competent really are they? The greatest leaders, the greatest black belts greatest musicians I've ever met were the people who, they didn't talk about how great they were. They were talking about what they were learning, what they were trying to learn, what they were trying to steal from other people, right? To incorporate into their own practice. Those are the folks that are really the most effective and in the most positive use of the word, the most powerful.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's almost like it's a question of their priorities, isn't it? It's like, what are they in their mind's eye? What are they putting first? And I think the ones
back to Admiral Grace Hopper, right? Management's about things, leadership's about people. Both are important. Again, I don't want to dismiss that. People, in fact, we for years we did a survey and we asked people, what's more important? Your people, the things, so on and so forth, or is it both? And the answer, well, it really is both. But if you had to pick one, gun to your head, you have to pick one. Which one is it going to? And I know what you're going to say.
Yeah, obviously. Yeah.
Right? Because without the people, it's interesting. I was just speaking for a group of financial managers in the construction industry. And again, it was one of these happy accidents. Couldn't have hoped for a better setup. Their journal, their most recent edition of their journal, had an article in it where this leader was talking about that. And he said, I learned to put my people first. It's exactly how he said it. He said, because I didn't for a while. And I realized I had a whole yard full of equipment and nobody to operate it. Right?
Yeah,
You've gone through a big crunch. And the flip side of that is sometimes, and again, I have to pull my judgment back, because sometimes people will say, they're doing things that are not as human-centric as you and I would support. And they're saying, hey, we're doing fine. Look at our financials. And they may be, I don't know, but there's another indicator we can look at to see if they're diluting themselves. So that's the churn rate. Show me your churn rate. And if they can't hang on to people, and if they take the time to look at how much that's costing them, because that can be a hidden cost, can't it?
Absolutely.
Eventually you see it in the bottom line, but for a long time that can be tucked away in the cost of training and retraining and so on.
Again, but, I think there's studies out there about that. I'm not sure it's that hidden anymore. I'm sure I saw
it. Shouldn't be, should it? Because we have some pretty hard figures.
So there's a guy I know over here he's a staff retention specialist.
Mm-hmm.
And the figure he quotes is every time you lose someone and you have to replace them, the cost of replacing them is like 300% of their salary.
Yeah, and it grows the higher levels of management, it grows and grows even more.
Yeah, because of the amount of time and the selection process. And absolutely.
But where it can be hidden is because, like I said, that training budget or the mentoring budget, if they have that too, it can be incremental. It's the scalded frog syndrome, right? The frog sitting in the pot doesn't feel the water.
Apparently that's a myth.
Yeah.
Apparently it's not true. The frog will jump out.
Well, that ruins the whole story.
Sorry, had to tell you.
Don't spread that around, because I keep using that.
I'll edit that bit out. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, and then there's that lost productivity in the meantime as well, because best will in the world. Once you've handed your notice in, you're not working as hard, are you?
Right.
And then there's the ramp up time for your replacement,
right, which you might not see till your annual reviews. Say, oh, geez, how'd that happen last year? Yeah. Scary. But simple. I mean, you keep, it's funny because you keep bringing up simple. I'd say the simple is the most powerful thing. But not easy. I mean, simple, not easy.
Yeah.
Getting a black belt, simple. Practice. You practice enough, you'll get there. Is it easy? It's long, it's arduous, it's painful, it's self-deprecating, and all these. Am I drawing a good picture of it? Positive experience, but that's what it is. And the same thing, leadership is simple. Take care of your people. Share. Is it easy? No. Let's not pretend. And that's where now we're kind of cycling back to, right? That's where we have to take all these nice philosophical word salad things and bring them to the table, roll up our sleeves, and figure out how to make tools out of them.
Definitely. Well, that's why we're here, isn't it? Well, you and I, anyway.
Thankfully, it's keeping me busy.
Yeah. Well, it's keeping me entertained now. That's the wrong word.
There you go.
Out of trouble. Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's, I don't know.
For what it's worth, too, and I felt that with you from the first discussion. You're the type of leader that we need, and I mean that from the heart. Because if you put people first, and I know you're a very skilled person in technical areas too, and that's really cool to see that intersection. Because sometimes I'll hear that excuse, well, I'm not a people person. Well, that's fine if you're at your workbench creating that invention and you're by yourself. That's fine. But even then, I'd argue, who puts up the most resistance? Sometimes salespeople, independent salespeople. They say, well, this is all fine, Jim, but I'm not a leader. I'm not in the inspiration business. I said, really? Aren't you going out to try to get business from these people you call customers? I said, now, if you embrace your role as a leader, how can you improve your performance as a salesperson? how about if you inspire these people, touch their hearts, not just their heads, because we don't buy features and that's been long dispelled, right? That's how we justify our emotional decision to buy something. All right. Which is important, but you're empowering them. You're giving them a solution to something, a desire or a need, right? And you're guiding them. That's your job as a salesperson. You're the one mentoring them through the process to find this, this answer to whatever they're looking for.
Yeah.
So now even the most isolated people, you're a leader to somebody, your kids,
yourself,
your neighbors, yourself. Yeah. Well, there you go. We could do a whole show just on that.
I mean, the sales one is a really interesting, again, great example, because I mean, I've had quite a few salespeople and sales communication experts, those sort of people on the show in the past. Like, I'm always struck by how closely the skill sets between leader and salesperson cross over. Like, they're almost identical in so many ways. And so I think I'm at the stage now in my thinking where if I meet a salesperson who says something like, I'm not a leader, I don't trust them to be a very good salesperson.
No, right. But I have come to understand, though, some of the trepidation, and it's usually, and I'll argue that this is more of a management issue than a leadership issue maybe I'm going to argue with myself on this one as I'm talking it out, because it's that transition from being independent and not having direct reports to now I'm the manager of a sales team, right? And I've been used to being very self-focused for a long time, but now I have to think about these other people too, who I may have even thought of as competitors before. Now, there's another Pandora's box we can open, because as a fighter, I'll tell you, my best friends are my competitors, right? If I'm not finding people better than me to compete with, I'm not growing as a fighter. So we learn to embrace that competition. We learn to love our competition.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, they're the people you have the most in common with, aren't they?
Yeah,
yeah,
and it's
about
okay.
The same thing. So.
It's okay to bash each other's brains in within the rule. But then it's also better to go have some beers afterwards. Now,
probably not in sales.
It's the same thing in sales. And when people move to that next level of management in the hierarchy, then yes, then it's important for them to embrace the things we're talking about today. That if they fall short in these, especially these three areas, if they're not good at thinking of other people in those terms, how to get them the tools they need to succeed, how to guide them, well, then those are areas to pay attention to. And that leads to one of the greatest arguments. Sometimes, well, Jim, people are bored. No, there's no natural born leaders. This is
yes, thank you.
Been dispelled for so long. No, somewhere along, it might have been your mom.
Yes,
it wasn't. But somebody gave you at least some of the tools you needed to get started on that journey. And everybody, again, you might not keep going back to the same trough for examples, but you might not be a Martin Luther King or a Winston Churchill, but you can improve as a leader. And that's all that counts.
Definitely. And yeah, I mean, those sales managers, I get why that is such a difficult transition for all the reasons you've said, but I also, and maybe it's part of a management issue, but I also think it's a leadership issue, but for the leader of that sales manager.
Mm-hmm.
Because really, oversimplifying it, all it takes, in inverted commas, is a conversation from their leader with that sales manager to just say, look, nothing's really changed in terms of the skills you need to have and the way you need to operate. It's just about the audience for those skills.
It's about sharing.
People you're leading.
Sharing.
Yeah, exactly. It's the people
sharing
you're
those
leading
skills. Yeah.
instead of people you're trying to sell to, but largely treat them the same way. It's it feels like a massive change, but it's not as massive as you think it is, I think, anyway.
There's one predicament that can really highlight people's fears about this too, because the ultimate predicament somebody can be in when they're cautious about sharing is, and again, this is something that comes up almost every presentation I do, say, you should be training your replacement. And of course, the natural pushback is, well, I don't want to train the guy who's going to take my job from this. Well, if you're in an organization where that's that much of a threat, maybe there needs to be some reassessment too. And don't get me wrong, I understand why people hold on to bad jobs. I've been there too. Sometimes circumstance, we're going to weigh, other priorities. But having said that, you do always have a choice, however difficult it might be. And if you're in an organization that, that's what you're there for, is to train someone who will do your same work for less money. That's not a good environment. But having said that, let's put that one aside for a second. You should be training your replacement. Why are you protective of that position? You want to move up or sideways or somewhere, right? And the saddest thing, and I've heard this many times in my career now, the saddest thing that I hear in that situation is I was being groomed for a promotion. I was being groomed for this other opportunity, but I didn't get it. Why? No one there to take my place. Whose fault is that? Right? Had you trained your replacement, that would have been part of your plan. Now I'm ready for that next job. And, here's David. He's ready to step in and take over. And there you go. So, yeah, but it's hard. I mean, it's human nature. I mean, our two strongest pulls are survival and self-interest, and we have to, manage those all the time. So, perceiving that threat, it takes a conscious effort, takes discipline to pull back from that. Again, martial arts, the gift from martial arts. Mm-hmm. We get our egos beat out of us pretty good if we're taught properly, and to be able to say, no, I'm going to train that next guy. Yeah. The greatest sensei in the world is not the person who thinks they're great. The greatest sensei in the world is the one who trains the teacher who surpasses me. Right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of my favorite concepts of leadership. There's probably a quote that I can't remember. I've heard it a few times and I can't remember who it was for, but basically it's about this idea of your legacy as a leader, and the greatest mark of success is when you make yourself redundant because you've created so many leaders around you that you're not needed anymore.
Absolutely.
And it's kind of poetic, isn't it? But it's so difficult to do, as you say, because it's that natural kind of, it's fear, isn't it? Like you're afraid that if you create your replacement, you'll be replaced, and then you're out, and you're gone, and you've lost everything you've worked for.
And we can't dismiss that out of hand. I mean, absolutely through not. That. It's fears are to be recognized and dealt with and managed. It's people. If we're talking in opposites, the opposite would maybe be courage, right? But courage is not the absence of fear. I mean, the absence of fear is stupidity.
Yeah, well, yes,
right.
That's a good point.
Yeah, but courage demands fear. If we're not experiencing genuine fear and danger and risk, then we're not acting courageously. We're just acting stupidly. So, or foolishly. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I'm slightly conscious of time. We've covered pretty much everything we were planning to talk about in a nice roundabout conversational way. I think that leader and manager, the way we define those is so interesting to me. And I think, I'd love to get your point of view on this. I think you can't do either of those without being able to do both, at least not well.
Yeah.
What do you think?
No, I agree with you 100%. I mean, it'd be nice if all managers were also competent leaders. Sadly, we don't see that all the time. But again, I encourage, and one of the great lessons from having some of the adventures that I've had, particularly the self-destructive ones, and I'm not exaggerating one bit when I say by right, I should be dead or in jail many times over. Okay. So I am one of these people that can authentically say, look, if I can do it, you can do it. There's no excuses. Right now, and humbly, I have to keep reminding myself of that all the time. All right. But that's an important thing to consider. So if you're a manager who's struggling with the leadership side, you can improve. I mean, there's nothing in your way from doing that except your own desire. But having said that too, right? Nobody could force me to quit drugs until I was ready to take that step. So you've got to be willing to take that step. You've got to be willing to look in the mirror. And the best tool, again, if you've ever been on a dojo, most dojos you go into, there's a whole wall of mirrors. It's sure not to check out how pretty we are. It's to provide, that was the high technology at the time, provide instant feedback, right? I want to see my flaws. I want to see my errors. I can't correct my flaws. I can't improve. And I want to embrace those. I want to embrace failure. Failure is the opportunity to grow and expand and change. So that's a mindset I think that we need to return to, that had been lost for at least a generation or two. We taught kids to be afraid of failure, to reject it. No, let's embrace it. Let's not do it foolishly. So let's not seek out foolish failure, but Let's do that. So we can all improve, we can all grow, we can all learn to grow and develop. Think about that, that white belt under the black belt, beginner's mind. And that's what's going to get us where we want to be.
We'll trot out another cliche, but it's I'll succeed or I'll learn, right? So,
amen.
Again, can't remember who said it. Probably somebody really important and famous. Oh, I'm going to get destroyed.
What's been Lao Tzu? Lao Tzu or Confucius, they are those guys who, they said a lot of good things.
My memory's failing me today, obviously. But
there you go.
Anyway, so a couple more questions if you're okay for time.
Sure, yeah.
If you could go back in time, how far back in your own life would you go, and what would you say to your younger self?
I have the great benefit of having been asked that question yesterday.
Man!
So I actually have a faster response today. I work, my volunteer passion is working with incarcerated youth. And I often work with young people that are 17, 18 years old, about the age where I was starting to get lost as far as my own self-worth and self-value, which led to my drug addiction. And so I'd go back to them. I'd go back to myself at that point and say, look, you know what? Ask for help. Seek out some mentors, seek out some guidance, and try not to fall into the trap of self-destruction, whatever that looks like, because it doesn't have to be drugs. It can be any number of things. And many, if not most people go through some cycle of that at some point in their life to some degree, right? So I think that would be pretty useful. I'd go back and say, hey, reach out. You don't have to do it alone.
Yeah. I think that's such an important lesson for leaders as well, because so often we put ourselves on that pedestal, don't we, of I'm the one with the answer. That's my role here. I can't ask for help. And
you're not doing it alone.
Absolutely.
The definition of leader is what, right? You're uniting people in a cause. No leader is alone. You can't be a leader on your own. Yeah. Transform me into we. No. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool.
Love that. All right. And my last and favorite question for you is called Leadership Heroes.
Leadership Heroes.
So if you had to pick one person, it could be anyone you like. They could be alive, dead, past, present, real, fictitious even, if you like. But that person should be someone that, in your opinion, would perfectly embody leadership. Who would that person be and why?
There's two I usually fall back on when people ask me that, but I'm going to use one today, Malcolm X, because he embodies, what a tragedy that, his life ended so young, because he was in the process of an amazing transformation when he was murdered. All right. And so my study of him really centers on that and validates and was really encouraging to me through many times when I had to go back and revisit that process of transformation. And I'm sure, Malcolm, I'll lean on you again. But that's it, because of his process of transformation.
Yeah, it's a good choice. I don't think we've had him before either. So bonus points. Well done.
I think the world would be a different, and I think in a lot of ways, much more positive place had he survived. Yeah.
Yeah. It's that's so often the way, though, isn't it?
He had a lot more to share. Yeah.
Isn't that so often the way? The tragedy of it, I think. There's so many. There's half a dozen we could list probably off the top of our heads. More cliches to trot out, like the brightest candle burns the least time, etc.
There you go.
But I don't think that diminishes the impact they did have in the short time they were here.
And they're still with us. That we have access to their words, their deeds.
Absolutely. Yeah, great choice. Thank you. Well, that's it, really. We're pretty much out of time. We've gone over time a little bit. So thank you for staying.
Thanks for your hospitality. It's been a blessing to get to meet you, David.
Oh, likewise. It's been wonderful talking with you today. And if any of the listeners want to know more about you, perhaps get a copy of a book or attend a workshop or all of the above, where can they go to learn more things?
The simplest thing is the Human-centric Leader.org. But I'm easy to find. LinkedIn, Facebook, all those places too.
Lovely. And I'll put that link in the show notes so everyone can find it easily.
All right.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for your time today. It's been great meeting you. Love this conversation as well, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, David.
Jim, thank you again so much for your time today. What a great conversation, and so much in there to learn for any leader, any manager, anyone who's struggling even in a business, regardless of your status, title and position, as we were saying earlier. If you would like to learn more about Jim and what he does, please do check those links in the show notes. Click on them, go and visit the website, find him on social media, reach out. I know he's always up for a conversation about leadership or most other things, really, as you may have been able to tell from today's episode. Thank you, listener or viewer, if you're with us on YouTube or Spotify now as well, for being with us today. Really appreciate you joining us, and I hope you got loads out of that episode as well. If leadership is something that you're struggling with, perhaps you are new in your role, you're new to leadership and management themselves, or perhaps you've recently been through a career transition of one kind or another. First of all, you're in the right place. This podcast is intended exactly for you, to give you some practical advice for free with no obligations or expectations of you. However, if you want to take that a step further, then I am also here to help. I'm all about helping those people like you who are in that transitional stage of leadership, such as new managers or first-time business founders, with your leadership skills so that you can become a leader, not a boss, that you can lead with integrity, build happier, higher performing teams, and create effective organizations. Ultimately, it's all about making a more successful team or business. I provide that help via 3 methods. One of them is this podcast. The other is the Integrity Leaders community, which you are very welcome to come along and join. As a podcast listener or viewer, you can, of course, benefit from a 50% discount for the entire lifetime of your membership using the discount code that you'll find in the show notes and hopefully on the screen if you're watching the video, but it's half off 24. Hit that green button, sign up now, use that discount code, come and join us. And of course, it is a monthly rolling subscription or membership fee. So if it's not for you, you can cancel any time. Again, there's no obligation. There's no stress about it. Just come along, see what you think, see if there's anything useful there for you. Get to know some other leaders and managers who are in similar stages of their career as you and probably facing very similar struggles or challenges with their workplace. And you can get to meet me as well. I don't know if that's a bonus, but we can have a conversation about leadership, which clearly, if you've made it this far in the episode, you already know I love doing. So yeah, I hope to see you there very soon and look forward to welcoming you aboard. Join us again next week for another great leadership conversation. And until then, stay safe, make the best of this new year, and be a leader, not a boss.